Hartwell Auction House, Millhaven, Ohio, a Saturday in October. Garrett Winslow stood at the back of the room, hands in his pockets, eyes on the wreck at the end of the lot, rust-eaten fenders, no rear glass. 3 bidders before him had looked and walked away. When he raised his paddle, the room turned. Then it laughed. Derek Caulfield didn't lower his voice. What's he going to do with that pile? Grow tomatoes? Sloane Merritt stood behind the podium and looked at Garrett. She didn't laugh. She brought the gavel down. Nobody knew that 30 days later the same car would stand on that same platform and nobody would be laughing. 2 days before the auction, Garrett was at the kitchen table when the Hartwell catalog email came through. He almost deleted it. He subscribed to about a dozen of these regional auction houses, estate sales, specialty dealers, and most weeks he skimmed the first page and moved on. But something made him open the attachment, and he scrolled to the last lot. The photo was poor, taken in flat. The car was a wreck, but Garrett set down his coffee and pinched the image open on his phone, zooming into the lower left corner where the chassis met the rocker panel. He stared at it for a long time. Then he went to his desk, printed the photo, and sat with it under the lamp. The drilling pattern, the spacing, the reinforcement points along the frame rail. Those weren't production line decisions. Those were hand-built decisions made by engineers who knew the car would be pushed past what a street chassis could handle. Garrett had seen that pattern on exactly 6 cars in his life, and all 6 had come out of the same shop. He called his neighbor Mrs. Dillard and asked if she could stay with Miles Saturday night. In the morning he drove Miles to Clover Hill Elementary in the truck with the cracked dashboard. Miles was in the back seat finishing a granola bar. "Where are you going today?" Miles asked. "Auction house. Going to look at a car." "Is it an ugly car or a good car?" Garrett thought about it. Both. Miles considered this with the seriousness of an 11-year-old who had spent most of his life in a garage. "Those are usually the interesting ones," he said. He got out at the curb and didn't look back. The preview period at Hartwell ran from 9 to 11 o'clock. Garrett arrived at 9:15 and walked the floor slowly. The room held 14 lots, 3 motorcycles, vintage road signs, several vehicles including a cherry 1964 Galaxy, and at the far end, lot 14, the wreck. He circled it once without stopping. Then he crouched beside it, clicked on his flashlight, and worked the beam along the undercarriage. The chassis number had been partially ground away, not maliciously, more like someone had tried to remove it decades ago for reasons he could guess at, but 3 characters remained at the trailing end of the sequence, just visible in the rust. He read them twice, then he stood up, clicked off the light, and dusted his hands on his jeans. Derek Caulfield was passing behind him, walking with another man Garrett recognized from the classic car club's silver hair, the unhurried posture of someone who spent money easily. Derek glanced at Garrett, then at the wreck, and said something to the man beside him that made them both smile. Garrett didn't turn around. At the podium, Sloane Merritt was reviewing her lot sheets. She was making notes without looking up, and she almost missed it. The man crouched in the dirt beside lot 14 with a flashlight. Almost. She made a mark on her bidder sheet, Winslow G, registration 47. Then she went back to her notes and wasn't sure why she'd bothered. When lot 14 came up, the opening bid was set low enough to be embarrassing. Sloane called for it twice before a hand went up in the back of the room. Garrett held his paddle steady. The room turned. There was a pause, and then someone laughed, and then several more did, and Derek Caulfield's voice came through cleanly. "What's he going to do with that pile, grow tomatoes?" Sloane looked at Garrett. He was looking at the car. No other bids came in. She brought the gavel down. The room was already moving on, but when Garrett stepped forward to initial the receipt, their eyes met for a moment, hers assessing, his giving nothing. And then she looked down at the paperwork and wrote his number in the column. Garrett got the car home on a rented flatbed the next morning and backed it into the garage at Millhaven Auto and Body. He'd been running the shop out of a converted machine shed on Elm Street for 4 years, just him, mostly, with occasional help from part-timers when a restoration job needed extra hands. The sign outside had weathered to the point where half the letters were guesswork. Ray Okafor was leaning against the wall outside when Garrett pulled in, a coffee mug in both hands, watching the street. They hadn't spoken in 4 years, not since the call that December after Garrett's wife died, when Ray had said the right things and Garrett had barely heard them. Now Ray watched the flatbed swing around and said nothing until the car was on the ground. "You found it," he said quietly. "Didn't find it, bought it." Ray set his mug on a cinder block and crouched beside the chassis. Garrett watched the older man's face do the thing it always did when Ray was thinking hard, completely still, no tells. Then Ray looked at the partial chassis code. 3 characters in the rust. He was quiet for 10 seconds. "You know what this is?" he said. Not a question. "I had a strong suspicion from the catalog photo, the drilling pattern on the rocker panel." Ray stood up slowly. "There were 5 of them. Internal prototype program, 1971 Dodge Challenger R/T, purpose-built for track development, never publicly registered, never sold through dealer channels. Callaway ran the program, then restructured in '09. After that, the 5 cars were supposed to be accounted for." He paused. "This one apparently wasn't." "I know. If you can verify provenance, legitimate auction house, independent inspection, you're looking at $380,000 to $500,000. I know that, too." Ray looked at him. "And you paid how much for it?" Garrett told him. Ray made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He knew because he had been the one who placed those codes, lead technical advisor on the Callaway prototype program, 1971. He'd built the registry himself 38 years ago. There were things he couldn't say officially, a non-disclosure agreement signed when Callaway restructured still had teeth. But what he could do was stand here and let Garrett's read of the chassis confirm itself. 9 years is a long time to be away from this work, Ray said. 4 years. You left Callaway in 2014. I left because Alan got her diagnosis. I came back to Millhaven. She died 2 years later. Garrett picked up a rag and wiped his hands, though his hands weren't dirty yet. I've been working on cars the whole time. You know what I mean. Garrett did. He laid a hand flat on the roof of the car, not a grand gesture, just a hand on cold metal, and stood there for a moment. There was something in it that wasn't sentiment and wasn't pride. It was something closer to recognition. He was standing in front of a thing that had been written off, and he knew what it actually was, and he was going to spend the next 30 days proving it. That afternoon, Sloan called Hartwell's accounting department to confirm the payment processing on Lot 14. Routine. She handled 3 other calls after that, then sat back at her desk and looked at the lot sheet she'd filed. Bidder 47. She opened a browser tab and typed, Garrett Winslow, Millhaven, Ohio. Auto repair shop on Elm Street. Website built in 2015. Sparse a few photos, a contact form, reviews that said things like honest and knows what he's doing. Nothing else. She closed the tab. She didn't close the window. Back in the garage, Garrett pulled the calendar off the wall and counted squares. 30 days. He put it back and walked to the far end of the shop and started making a list. 30 days, enough if he didn't sleep much. The first week was mostly demolition. Every panel off, every line disconnected, the interior stripped to bare metal. Garrett worked from 6 o'clock in the morning until past midnight on most days, eating at the workbench, taking calls from part suppliers in Kentucky and Tennessee and Michigan between jobs. He scrolled numbers on the inside of a pizza box and taped it to the wall. He ordered a set of NAS chrome trim pieces from a dealer in Nashville who had them in a warehouse and didn't know what he had. He found the correct carburetor on a forum, drove to Dayton on a Wednesday evening to pick it up, and drove home in the dark. Miles came to the garage after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He'd drop his backpack behind the parts counter, spin once on the old desk chair, and pull out his homework. He didn't talk much while he worked, which was something he'd gotten from his father. But after 20 minutes or so, he'd ask something. What color are you going to paint it? Garrett was under the car and didn't look up. Original color. What's original? Garrett slid out, looked at his son. Plum crazy purple. Miles made a face like he'd bitten something sour. That's a real color? Came from the factory. That's the worst name for a color I've ever heard. Dodge named it. Dodge was wrong. Garrett laughed. It caught him off guard, the laugh and the ease of it. He went back under the car. On the seventh day, a car pulled up outside. Sloane Merritt came in with a clipboard and a measured expression, and Garrett opened the garage door wider and said, "Come in," without asking why she was there. She explained the follow-up policy Hartwell liked to track condition and disposition data on specialty lots. It informed their pricing models. She tried to make contact within the first 2 weeks, and she said it all in a tone that made it sound like something she did for every buyer, which was probably not entirely true, and both of them knew it. The car was stripped down to frame and floor. No wheels, no seats, no glass. Sloane looked at it with an expression she kept professional. And Garrett walked her through what was staying and what wasn't. And he did it in the specific and hurried language of someone who doesn't need to explain because they already know, but is explaining anyway because they've been asked. She watched him handle the remains of the original steering column careful, like it was still attached to something, and she understood then that this was not a man guessing at what he had. This was a man reading a book he'd read before. "Do you have plans to resell after restoration?" she asked. "Hartwell could list it for you." "Not sure yet." She wrote that down. It was the wrong answer for what she'd asked, and it was the right answer for what she actually wanted to know, and the distinction bothered her. When she left, she glanced back once. He had already turned back to the car, the garage light bright behind him. She opened the clipboard and wrote, "A technical competency buyer appears to have specialist knowledge follow." She underlined the last word twice, then stared at what she'd written like she was reading someone else's handwriting. Word got back to Derek Caulfield by day 10, carried in through the Classic Car Club's informal network, the way gossip always moves in small towns. Someone had driven past the garage on Elm. Someone had heard something. Someone had mentioned it at dinner. The mechanic with the junkyard was apparently doing something serious with the car. Derek had laughed the first time he heard it. Then he sent a man named Holt. Holt came in on a Thursday morning with a business card from Caulfield Motors and a rehearsed pitch about private buyers. Garrett was at the back of the shop and heard the bell over the door and came out wiping his hands. "Not for sale," Garrett said before Holt finished his introduction. Holt tried the angle about fair market value, about saving Garrett the hassle of a second auction listing, about cash on the table. During all of this he kept looking at the car in the back, covered now under a gray canvas tarp, every edge of it hidden. Garrett stood between Holt and the tarp and didn't move. "Not for sale," he said again. Holt left. Garrett watched his car go down Elm and turn right and disappear. That evening Derek called Sloane directly. He had her personal number because she had made the mistake years ago of giving it to him when he was the auction house's best client and she was still learning when to set limits. He asked, in the friendly tone he used when he was asking for something he expected to get, whether she could share any technical information from the lot file, previous VIN records, any documentation the seller had disclosed. Sloane said that information was internal and she wasn't able to share it. Derek mentioned that Caulfield Motors spent close to $400,000 a year through Hartwell's various auction channels. Sloane said she'd heard him and that she'd answered his question. Then she ended the call. She sat at her desk for a few minutes after that. She hadn't told Garrett about Derek's first inquiry. She wasn't sure if she should. She wasn't sure what she'd say if she did. She pulled up the bidder contact file and copied the garage number to her phone under a name that was just Winslow Lot 47. On day 18 she drove to the garage again. No clipboard this time. She parked on Elm and walked in and told him she'd been passing by. He looked at her. Then he looked out at the street which dead-ended 200 yards past his driveway and a chain-link fence. Then he looked at her again. He didn't say anything. He opened the door wider. The car was partially reassembled, now bare metal, some of the structural work done, the interior still gutted. Garrett was fitting a small component back onto the engine block, working with both hands in a tight space, and after a moment he said, without looking up, "Hold this." Sloane set her bag down. She came over and put both hands where he indicated and held the piece steady while he worked the fitting. They stayed like that for 3 minutes without speaking, her hands where he needed them, his working around hers, the shop filling with the small sounds of metal on metal and nothing else. When he was done, he said, "Thank you." Sloane didn't pick her bag up right away. Night 22, Miles was at his grandmother's and the garage was quiet in the way garages get when there's no one else in them. Not silent exactly, because old buildings breathe, but empty in a way Garrett could feel. He sat on the concrete floor with his back against the driver's side door, legs stretched out, and looked at the ceiling. Not the posture of a man in crisis, more like the posture of a man doing arithmetic in his head, adding up what was owed and what was being paid and checking whether the columns balanced. On the shelf above the parts bins, there was a photograph in a small frame. Not displayed prominently, pushed back against the cinder block between a manual and a coffee can of hex bolts, the photograph was from 2006. Ellen standing next to a car in a white shop coat, squinting against the Columbus sun, one hand on the hood. The car was a 1968 Trans Am racer, the first Garrett had fully restored at Callaway, and she had driven up to see it on delivery day and stood there with her hand on the hood and said, "You made something." She'd been the one who told him to come home. Stage 3, February 2013. He'd been 2 weeks out from finishing a Shelby Cobra restoration that was going to sell for $900,000 at Barrett-Jackson, and she called him on a Tuesday and said, "I don't need you at Callaway. I need you here." He'd driven home that night. She died in March 2016. He never went back to Columbus. His phone buzzed on the workbench. 10:03 A message from Sloane checking on the title transfer documentation. "Did you receive the secondary paperwork from the county?" He looked at it. Standard question. Could have waited until morning. He wrote back that he had the paperwork and that the car was on schedule. He looked at the message for a moment after he sent it. Nobody had asked about the car's schedule. 3 minutes later she wrote back, "I know." He set the phone face down on the workbench and didn't look at it again that night. Day 25 Ray came back in the afternoon with a folded piece of paper he set on the workbench without explaining. Garrett unfolded it. It was a photocopy of a page from a trade publication, Restoration Today, November 2011, a feature on prototype programs from American muscle manufacturers. The Callaway section ran 2 pages. No photographs of individual cars. No mention of the engineers by name. But the technical specifications, frame drilling patterns, and chassis reinforcement specs, the custom carburation program were described in enough detail that anyone with the right background would know exactly which cars it was describing. Ray picked up his coffee. "I didn't bring that," he said and walked out. Garrett read the article twice. Then he laid it flat on the workbench and put a wrench on top of it so it wouldn't slide. This was the piece he'd been missing, not the proof, but the bridge. If he could link the chassis code to the technical specs in this article and get someone with auction credentials to formalize the connection, the provenance argument could hold. He looked at the calendar. 5 days. Then he looked at his phone. Sloane's name still on the screen from the night before. He didn't call. He didn't put the phone away either. Day 27. Sloane arrived at her office at 7:40 in the morning and found an email waiting that had come in at 11 o'clock the previous night. No sender name, no subject line, a single attachment, a scanned document, 8 pages. The header reading Callaway Motorsport Heritage Internal Vehicle Registry Restricted, dated January 2009. She read it carefully. 5 chassis numbers fully listed. Against each one, basic specs, build date, program designation. The 5th car on the list had 3 characters at the end of its chassis number that she had seen before. She forwarded it to Hartwell's IT desk and asked them to trace the sending address. The response came back that afternoon. A public computer at the Columbus Metropolitan Library, Northside branch. She sat with that for a while. Then she pulled the original lot file and found the name that had appeared in the CC field of the document's internal routing header. Ray Okafor, lead technical advisor. She dialed the number she found for him. He picked up on the third ring. "Mr. Okafor, this is Sloan Merritt from Hartwell Auction House in Millhaven. I received an interesting document this morning." A long pause. "I didn't send you anything." "I know. I'm restricted from making certain disclosures. Have been for 16 years. I understand." Another pause. "You should ask Garrett directly about the years 2006 through 2014. His voice was even, almost professional, like he was describing a route on a map. "That's all I'd say." Then he hung up. Sloan drove to the garage that afternoon with her laptop and a bag over her shoulder and no other explanation prepared. Garrett was at the workbench when she walked in. She set the laptop on the cleared corner of the bench and opened it and turned the screen toward him and didn't say anything. He looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked up at her, not past her, not to the side, but at her directly, the way he hadn't done in any of the previous visits. "You need an official confirmation?" he asked. "I need to understand what I'm looking at." "You're looking at why I bought the car," he told her. "Not everything, but enough, the bones of it. Callaway in 15 years and the 60-something cars he'd restored, some of which had sold at Barrett-Jackson for numbers that had made collectors go quiet in their seats." He told her about leaving in 2014 and why. He told her about Ellen. He said all of it in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of someone who is not performing grief, but is not pretending it isn't there either. He spoke like a man explaining a series of decisions that all made sense at the time. Sloan listened. She was good at listening. It was a professional skill, reading what was said and what was underneath it, and she heard both. When he finished, she looked at the car. The body panels were on now. The paint was going on in stages. She hadn't known what plum crazy purple would look like on a full car, and she found she'd been picturing it wrong. It wasn't garish. Under the garage lights, it was deep and almost liquid, the kind of color that changed depending on where you stood. "What are you going to do with it when you're done?" she asked. "Return it to where it belongs." She didn't know if he meant the marketplace or something else. She didn't ask. When she left, she stood outside the garage door for a moment before getting in her car. The light inside was warm. She could hear him moving around in there, tools settling, footsteps on concrete. It occurred to her, standing in the parking lot on Elm Street on a Thursday evening in October, that she was paying attention, not analyzing, not calculating angles, just paying attention to AA the way she used to do before she learned not to. She drove home and didn't quite know what to do with that. On the evening of day 29, the car was finished. Garrett stood against the far wall with his arms folded and looked at it. All four wheels on the ground, the paint solid and deep under the shop lights, the chrome trim the correct chrome trim, sourced and verified, catching the light off the ceiling. The interior rebuilt to original spec, down to the correct seat fabric and the correct dash bezels. If you didn't know the car's history, you would think it was a very fine restored Challenger. If you knew the car's history, you would understand what you were actually looking at. Ray was there. He'd come by with sandwiches and hadn't left. He sat on the stool by the parts counter and looked at the car. "Will you disclose the provenance at the sale?" he asked. "If Sloan can formalize it through Hartwell, yes. If she can't, I sell it as a documented restoration and walk away with enough to fix the roof." "You didn't do this for the money." "No." Garrett looked at his watch. "But Miles needs new shoes." Ray laughed a real laugh, not polite. Garrett smiled. At 9 o'clock that evening, Sloan called. She'd spent the better part of the week working through it, the anonymous document, the trade publication piece, an independent inspection she'd arranged with a specialist from a respected shop in Cincinnati. She had a provenance file that was not definitive, but was legitimate. Claimed heritage, supported by physical examination and partial documentation, disclosed fully in the listing. Not Sotheby's standard, Hartwell standard, with complete transparency. Garrett listened. Then he said, "Will Derek cause problems for you?" A pause. The first time he had asked her a question that was about her rather than the car. "Probably," she said. "That's my problem." An hour later, there was a knock at the garage door. Garrett opened it and found Derek Caulfield standing in the driveway in a blazer. The kind of man who dressed well even when he was doing something he shouldn't be doing. Derek looked at the car. His face went through several expressions in quick succession. The last one was want. Plain and uncomplicated want. He offered $120,000 on the spot. Cash or a check tonight to avoid the auction process entirely. Garrett shook his head. Derek pushed the number higher. He explained the logic. Avoiding fees, avoiding uncertainty, clean transaction. He was reasonable about it. He was persuasive. He'd had a lot of practice. Garrett said, "You waited 30 days to ask." "I spent 30 days to build my answer." He stepped back and closed the garage door. He stood in the quiet for a moment. From the cot he'd set up in the corner because Miles' grandmother had plans and Miles needed somewhere to sleep came a small voice. "Dad." Garrett walked over. Miles was sitting up, blanket in his lap, looking at the car with the drowsy focus of a kid who'd been half asleep and woken up for something. "That's the car." Miles said, "That's the car. It's a weird color." Miles looked at it seriously. "But it's a good car." Garrett crouched beside the cot and put his hand on his son's shoulder. Miles leaned against him and was asleep again in 30 seconds. Garrett didn't move for a while. Later, when the garage was finally quiet, he walked to the car and opened the driver's door and sat down. The seat was right. The steering wheel was exactly where it should be. He put both hands on it and looked through the windshield at the open garage door and the dark street beyond. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there. Saturday morning. The Hartwell auction house on Whitmore Street was full in a way it rarely was. Not standing room, but close. The parking lot had cars from out of county. People who didn't usually come to Millhaven Regional Sales were there with paddles already in hand, talking quietly to one another in the way collectors do when they think something real might happen. Sloan had listed the car 3 days earlier with a full write-up, claimed prototype provenance from a known 1971 production program, unverified by original manufacturer, supported by independent mechanical inspection and partial documentation disclosed per Hartwell's buyer transparency policy. She had included high-resolution photographs, the inspection report, the page from the trade publication, and a note on the chassis code correlation. It was more documentation than most lots in this room had ever seen. Derek Caulfield had called her office twice that week. She hadn't taken either call. The Challenger rolled onto the platform at 10:47. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a room moving between lots. A real quiet, the kind that happens when the thing in front of you is actually what was promised. Plum crazy purple under the auction house lights, chrome correct, stance low and planted. Several people in the front row stood up without meaning to. Sloan called the opening bid at $95,000. There were 4 paddles immediately. Within 4 minutes, the room was at $240,000 and narrowing. By 7 minutes, it was Derek and a buyer from Cincinnati whose name was on the registration as a private collector Sloan didn't recognize. They went back and forth with the focus of 2 men who had both decided to win. 310, 325, 340, 355. Derek raised his paddle, paused at $355,000. Sloan watched the room. She found Garrett in the back, same position as 30 days ago, back row, hands in his pockets, looking at the car. He hadn't bid. He'd consigned the car to Hartwell 3 days before the sale and stepped out of the process. He was just watching. The Cincinnati buyer raised his paddle, $360,000. Derek looked at his paddle. He looked at the car. He set the paddle on his knee. Sloan gave the room 10 seconds. $360,000 going once. She paused. Going twice. The room was perfectly still. She brought the gavel down. The room broke into applause, scattered at first, then spreading. Derek Caulfield rose from his seat and walked toward the exit without speaking to anyone. Not hurrying, but not stopping, either. People watched him go. Sloane wrote the sale number on the sheet in front of her and signed her name. She looked up. Garrett was looking at her from across the room. Not smiling. Just looking with the particular steadiness of a man who had said what he needed to say without opening his mouth. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at her paperwork, and was aware that something had shifted, though she couldn't have said precisely when. The crowd thinned over the next half hour. Garrett signed the settlement the side table after Hartwell's commission and fees. $306,000 and change landed in an account that had been running on careful math for 4 years. He stood in the hallway looking at the number on the form and let out a slow breath. It wasn't the number that moved him. It was the fact of it, the proof that what he'd seen in a catalog photograph at his kitchen table 3 weeks ago had been real, and that seeing it had mattered, and that the work had been worth doing. Derek came down the hall. He stopped in front of Garrett and looked at him, not with hostility. Not with the edge he'd carried in every interaction up to now. He looked like a man doing a calculation and coming out on the wrong side of it. "You knew from the beginning," Derek said. "Yes." Derek studied him for another moment. He glanced down the hall toward the now empty auction floor, then back. "I looked at the same catalog," he said, "same photograph." Something shifted in his expression, not quite respect, but the thing that precedes it. "I didn't see what you saw. Most people don't." Derek held his gaze. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way people do when they're acknowledging something they'd rather not. He walked on without offering a hand, which was honest at least. Sloane found Garrett near the side door a few minutes later holding an envelope with the settlement summary and the formal closeout papers. She handed it to him and he took it. "You didn't tell me about your history with Callaway when I first asked about the car," she said. "You didn't ask. I searched your name." "I know." She stopped. "When did you know?" He said it plainly. "When you came to the garage the first time. You asked about the valve train configuration on a prototype spec engine. That's not a question someone asks without reading first." She looked at him. It was a specific kind of look. The expression of a person who is used to being the one who has done the reading encountering someone who noticed. She'd had the advantage, she thought. She'd done the homework and he'd clocked it the moment she walked through the door and never said a word. She didn't have an answer ready. That was unusual for her. The main doors opened and Miles came in at a half-run, his grandmother right behind him, still in her coat. Miles headed straight for his father. "How much?" he said. "Enough for new shoes." Miles narrowed his eyes. "Just shoes? And maybe paint the garage." Miles weighed this and appeared to find it reasonable. Then he looked at Sloane, the frank, uncomplicated assessment of an 11-year-old who has no reason to be anything but direct. "You're the one who sold my dad's car," he said. "I held the gavel," Sloane said. Miles thought about this seriously. "That's more important." Garrett looked at her and for the first time without any armor around it, he smiled. 2 weeks later the garage on Elm Street had a different car on the lift, a '68 Mustang that needed a full interior rebuild. Bread and butter work, a job Garrett had taken from a retired teacher in Defiance who'd been driving the car for 20 years and wanted another 20. Garrett was under it when Ray's truck pulled into the lot. Ray came in and sat on the stool without being invited, which was the only way he ever sat on it. "Callaway reached out," he said. Garrett slid out from under the car on his back and looked at the ceiling. "They traced the sale," Ray continued. "They're not pursuing anything. Chain of title is clean going back 30 years, nothing to claim. But they want to talk. They're asking if you'd be interested in coming back in some capacity." He paused. "Consulting or more than that, depending." Garrett looked at the Mustang's undercarriage for a moment, then he sat up.
What did you tell them? That I'd pass it along. Ray didn't say anything else.
He had a talent for leaving space in conversations learned over a long career of working with men who thought better when they weren't being pushed. Garrett was still sitting there when he heard the sound of a car in the lot.
Not Ray's truck. He knew Ray's truck. He heard the door and then footsteps on the concrete, and he recognized those, too.
Sloane came in without knocking, which she had apparently stopped doing. She had nothing in her hands, no clipboard, no bag, no professional prop of any kind. She stood in the middle of the garage in her coat and looked at Garrett sitting on the floor next to the Mustang.
Calloway called the office, she said, to confirm the provenance documentation was legitimate for their records. I heard. He got to his feet. Ray just told me they asked whether you might want to come back.
She was watching him carefully.
They asked me. Garrett was quiet for a moment. They asked you. They asked whoever knew you best right now. A pause, smaller this time. I don't know why I answered that.
The garage was quiet. Not the tense quiet of two people on opposite sides of something, the quiet of two people standing in the same place, arriving at the same understanding at close to the same moment, which is a different thing entirely.
Do you want to see what else came in? Garrett said.
It was not a romantic question. It was the question of a man who wanted a reason for someone to stay.
Sloane looked at the Mustang. 68 interiors.
What fabric did they use?
Are you asking because you want to know or because you want to stay?
She met his eyes. Both.
Garrett stood up fully.
He extended his hand, not for a handshake, just a gesture.
The kind you make when you're inviting someone further into a room.
Sloane put her hand in his. They walked toward the back of the garage. The door stayed open. The late afternoon light came through at a low angle, the way October light does in Ohio, and laid two long shadows across the concrete floor, longer than the people who made them. Neither of them had been looking for this, but that, as it turned out, was exactly why it was here.